Imagine for a moment a new Suez Canal, not in Egypt, not in the Middle East, but carved straight through the heart of East Africa. A canal so massive, so strategically placed, that it could change the fate of nations from the Great Lakes to the Indian Ocean. Now picture the Democratic Republic of Congo, known as DRC, a country often described as the richest piece of land on Earth, yet trapped, suffocating, squeezed by distances so vast and terrain so unforgiving that it has become, in practice, a landlocked giant. A nation with a coastline, yet no real ocean access for its eastern trade. A contradiction so costly that for decades it shaped the country's economic destiny. And now imagine leaders, engineers, economists, and strategists gathering in quiet rooms, late at night, discussing something once considered impossible. A canal cutting across nations, reshaping borders only with water, providing Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and Eastern Congo a direct, unbroken line to the Indian Ocean. No port strikes, no blocked borders, no political ransom, no reliance on congested coastal gateways, a canal that could rewrite Africa's trade routes forever. The idea sounds too big, too wild, too ambitious. Yet so did the Suez Canal in 1869, mocked by its critics, nearly bankrupted, nearly abandoned, until the first ships passed through and changed the world. Today, East Africa is wrestling with the exact same question. Can it dare to build something just as radical? The proposal is official. Experts have started working on construction plans. It began as a small regional debate and has now spread across think tanks, editorial pages, and economic roundtables. It is a mix of necessity, frustration, and imagination born from a continent refusing to remain limited by old bottlenecks. To understand why this idea is gaining momentum, you must first understand the pressure points. East Africa's gateway ports Mombasa in Kenya, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania are overwhelmed. Strikes, political tensions, logistical delays, and spiraling costs have choked the lifelines of entire nations. For countries like Uganda and Rwanda, the price of importing a single container has risen by up to 40% in some years, almost entirely due to port congestion. For South Sudan, every day of delay can cost millions. For the DRC, especially its rapidly growing eastern provinces, the problem is existential. To move copper, cobalt, gold, timber, and agricultural exports, companies must transport goods thousands of kilometers westward toward the Atlantic across jungles, collapsed roads, and slums of logistical chaos. Or they must send their shipments eastward through Tanzania or Kenya, where ports are struggling under their own weight. The DRC is technically not landlocked, but its reality, economic, logistical, and geographic says otherwise. And that is why the canal idea exploded. But to see the full picture, we must go deeper into Congo's story. A story that blends geography, geopolitics, and the raw forces that shape the entire world economy. The world's fastest-growing copper mine, Kamoa-Kakula, sits here. One of the world's largest reserves of cobalt, essential for electric car batteries, is here. Trillions of dollars of untapped minerals lie beneath Congolese soil. The stakes are not small, they are global. And just recently, cameras captured something extraordinary, a sprawling industrial complex rising out of remote Congolese land, the Kamoa-Kakula Copper Complex. A mine so large and so clean that it is now described as the world's fastest-growing, highest-grade, and lowest-carbon major copper operation. A project powered by hydropower. A project that built Africa's largest copper smelter. A project that symbolizes Congo's future if Congo can access the world. And that is the heart of this story. A canal is not simply an engineering dream. It is a reaction, a rebellion, a refusal to stay trapped in a system designed decades ago when African voices were rarely in the room. So tonight, we dig into this extraordinary idea. Where did it come from? Why now? Why East Africa? Why Congo? And most importantly, could it actually happen? This is the story of a continent reconsidering its geography. A story of nations trying to break free from old maps. A story of a region imagining what the future could look like if they dared to draw a new line, a new waterway, a new lifeline straight through the heart of East Africa. Let's begin. As discussions about this proposed canal spread across economic forums and diplomatic circles, many viewers might wonder why such an ambitious idea is even on the table. After all, carving a man-made waterway through the heart of East Africa is not a minor engineering decision, it is a geopolitical statement. Yet to understand why nations are even considering a project of this magnitude, one must look beyond the maps and into the reality of East African trade. The truth is simple. The region is entering a new era, one defined not by aspiration but by necessity. For decades, the landlocked nations of East Africa have been bound to two major gateways: the port of Mombasa in Kenya and the port of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. These ports are the lifelines linking millions of people to global markets. But the problem is that these same ports are increasingly overwhelmed. Congestion has become routine, delays have become predictable, and political risks, including unrest, strikes, and tariff changes, have turned these gateways into vulnerabilities rather than secure pipelines of commerce. When a single coastal protest or labor strike can halt the supply chain of half a continent, leaders begin to ask whether dependence has gone too far. The Democratic Republic of Congo finds itself at the center of this conversation, not because of its coastline, but because of the unique geographic contradiction it represents. Yes, the DRC touches the Atlantic Ocean, but only through a narrow, largely undeveloped strip near the town of Banana. The economic heart of the country, however, lies thousands of kilometers away, deep within its interior, close to the borders of Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi. Minerals, agricultural products, machinery, fuel, consumer goods, nearly all trade must cross vast terrain to reach a port. In practical terms, this makes the DRC landlocked for almost all commercial and industrial activity. That logistical reality comes at a heavy cost. Even with the emergence of the Banana Deepwater Port project, the distance between extraction sites and the coastline remains immense. Transporting goods westward through the DRC is slow, expensive, and hazardous. As a result, companies and governments rely on East African ports for efficiency, but because these ports are shared by multiple countries, competition for capacity grows each year. This is the context behind the canal idea. A bold attempt to reimagine African trade geography, to rewrite the map rather than continue negotiating around its limitations. To understand how radical this idea is, one must compare it to the example that originally inspired it, the Suez Canal. When the Suez Canal was completed in 1869, it fundamentally reshaped global trade. It slashed travel times between Europe and Asia by thousands of kilometers, shifted economic power, and cemented Egypt as one of the world's most strategically important countries. Today, 12% of the world's trade passes through that narrow waterway, but the true lesson of Suez is not its economic importance, it is the audacity behind it. At the time, many thought it was impossible. Many saw it as madness. But visionaries insisted that geography could be redesigned. East African leaders, in their own way, are echoing that sentiment. They look at the risks facing modern supply chains: piracy near the Gulf of Aden, political tensions in the Red Sea, bottlenecks in traditional ports, and they wonder whether a bold alternative could secure their economic future. If global powers can consider building the Ben Gurion Canal in Israel as an alternative to Suez, why can't Africa think just as big? Still, the canal concept remains exactly that, a concept. There is no blueprint, no signed agreement, no feasibility study. Much of the discussion springs from think tank papers, exploratory editorials, and speculative proposals shared by economists and regional planners. Yet this is how most great infrastructural revolutions begin, not with concrete, but with conversation. And at the core of that conversation lies a simple, unavoidable truth: East Africa's growing population and economy cannot rely indefinitely on existing routes. Alternatives must be explored. Options must be imagined. While the canal proposal captivates the public, another transformation is already underway beneath the surface of Central Africa's mineral-rich lands. The DRC's Kamoa-Kakula copper complex stands today as a symbol of what the future of African development could look like. It is not simply a mine, it is a declaration that Africa is capable of producing world-class industrial infrastructure powered by clean, renewable energy. It is, by every measurable standard, one of the most technologically advanced mining operations on the planet, and its copper output plays a central role in global electrification and the clean energy transition. The fact that the world's fastest-growing, highest-grade, lowest-carbon copper mine is located in the Congo speaks volumes. It underscores why trade routes matter, why logistics matter, why access to the ocean is more than a convenience. It is a lifeline for countries trying to ascend the global economic ladder. Because a project like Kamoa-Kakula cannot reach its full potential if its exports are slowed by unreliable corridors, congested ports, and politically unstable coastal gateways. The world is hungry for copper, cobalt, lithium, and rare minerals, and the DRC has them in abundance. But the world is also impatient. Nations want rapid delivery. Manufacturers want predictable timelines. Investors want stability. This tension between Africa's rising resource power and its limited trade infrastructure is what fuels the dream of an East African Ship Canal. As Part 2 ends, one thing becomes clear. The proposal is not merely about carving a waterway. It is about carving a future. It is about deciding whether East Africa will continue depending on systems built during colonial times, or whether it will take the extraordinary step of building infrastructure that reflects its own economic destiny. The debate is not about engineering, it is about sovereignty. It is about unlocking opportunity for millions who live far from the ocean, but remain chained to it economically. When analysts first heard the idea of carving a Suez-style canal through East Africa, many reacted with disbelief. Some dismissed it as an impossible dream. Others mocked it as a grand political fantasy. But those who took a closer look realized something surprising. The proposal, while enormously challenging, is not ridiculous. In fact, it is rooted in real pressures and genuine strategic logic. And when powerful economic forces collide with long-term geopolitical necessity, even the most unimaginable engineering projects can move closer to reality. To understand the weight behind this proposal, we must examine the complex forces reshaping East African trade. The region is not simply dealing with congestion, it is navigating a landscape of rising uncertainty. In recent years, the global supply chain has been repeatedly shaken by geopolitical conflicts, shipping bottlenecks, port strikes, and naval tensions. The crisis in the Red Sea alone has rerouted hundreds of vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to travel times. Insurance costs have surged, shipping prices have climbed, and the fragility of Africa's access to global markets has been exposed more dramatically than ever. For East Africa's landlocked nations Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and the Eastern DRC, this fragility is amplified. They depend entirely on stable passage through someone else's territory, someone else's bureaucracy, someone else's politics. A single election dispute in Kenya, a sudden tariff change in Tanzania, a port workers' strike, or a shift in coastal security can instantly choke their supply lines. The vulnerability is structural, not temporary. This is why forward-thinking African economists argue that the continent must stop relying on corridors built during the colonial era. The British constructed Mombasa for their own extraction. The Germans developed Dar es Salaam for their own imperial interests. The Portuguese shaped Angola's ports for European trade, not African autonomy. Yet more than a century later, African economies remain tied to these inherited pathways. The proposed canal, radical as it is, represents a break from that dependence, a redesign of geography on Africa's terms, not Europe's. But the challenges are impossible to ignore. Constructing a canal of this magnitude requires unprecedented engineering. The Suez Canal passed through flat desert. The proposed East African Canal would pass through a region of mountains, forests, rivers, wetlands, and tectonic instability. It would need to cross thousands of kilometers of terrain, much of which is politically sensitive or sparsely governed. The financial cost alone would be measured not in billions, but potentially in the hundreds of billions, a price tag higher than any infrastructural project Africa has ever attempted. And yet, Africa stands at a unique moment in its history. The continent is no longer the world's forgotten frontier. It is the next energy hub, the next mining epicenter, the next manufacturing base, the next demographic superpower. Investors now look toward Africa not as a charity case, but as an economic engine. The success of the Kamoa-Kakula copper complex is a perfect example. This mine has rapidly become the world's most impressive major copper producer, the fastest growing, highest grade, and lowest carbon copper operation on the planet. It uses renewable hydropower, recycles heat, integrates clean smelting technology, and is positioned to dominate global copper supply for decades. Why does this matter in a discussion about the canal? Because copper is the metal of the future. Copper powers electric vehicles, renewable grids, solar farms, wind turbines, data centers, everything that defines the 21st century technological landscape. And the DRC holds one of the world's richest copper reserves. But even the best mines cannot operate in isolation. Without reliable trade routes, copper cannot reach buyers. Without fast export channels, investment slows. Without predictable logistics, global industries hesitate. That is why Kamoa-Kakula symbolizes a broader truth. Africa's economic revolution requires logistical revolution. The DRC is trying to solve this problem through several ongoing infrastructure projects, such as the new deepwater port at Banana. For the first time in its history, the DRC will have a modern coastal gateway capable of receiving large vessels and processing international cargo efficiently. The rehabilitation of rail links toward Angola aims to connect Congo's interior to the Atlantic via the Lobito corridor, creating an east-west trade route that could reshape regional commerce. These projects matter. They will bring real, measurable economic benefits, but they do not eliminate the strategic vulnerability of East Africa's interior regions. The biggest mines, the fastest-growing cities, and the densest population centers lie closer to Uganda and Rwanda than to the DRC's western coastline. That means transport times remain long, costs remain high, and political risks remain tied to neighboring states. This is why the idea of the canal refuses to die. Because at its core, the proposal solves a problem that no rail project, no port expansion, no road upgrade truly addresses. The need for direct ocean access for countries that have never had it. A ship canal is more than a trade route. It is sovereignty. It is independence. It is freedom from dependence on someone else's coastline. But the engineering realities still stand like immovable mountains. A canal of this nature requires massive excavation, lock systems, environmental mitigation, displacement management, political agreements across multiple nations, and long-term financial guarantees. It would need to overcome not only physical obstacles, but political disagreements, border disputes, and regional rivalries. It would need funding from global powers, development banks, sovereign wealth funds, or perhaps a consortium of mining companies that depend on reliable export lanes. And even if all that were feasible, the environmental considerations would be monumental. Cutting through ecosystems could disrupt water tables, wildlife migration routes, agricultural zones, and community lands. Planners would need to balance ambition with sustainability in a way that has rarely been attempted at this scale. Yet, despite all the complexity, some experts insist the idea is not impossible, just difficult. They point to the once unthinkable success of the Suez Canal. They note that China's Belt and Road Initiative has built railways, tunnels, bridges, and ports across continents once considered untouchable. They mention the Ben Gurion Canal proposal in Israel, which itself is a response to global insecurity around the Suez route. They argue that Africa, too, deserves the right to dream big. If the world wants Africa's minerals, markets, and labor force, then the world must also invest in Africa's sovereignty and logistical autonomy. Part 3 ends with this crucial point. The canal may or may not be built. It may remain a concept, a bold thought experiment, a provocative column piece that sparks debate and imagination. But it raises a question that Africa can no longer ignore. Should the continent continue accepting its inherited geography, or should it dare to redesign it? If the canal proposal were only an engineering question, the debate would still be enormous. But the moment such an idea enters the geopolitical arena, the stakes multiply. Because Africa's trade routes are not just African issues, they are global arteries that feed the world's industries, energy markets, and technology supply chains. And the mere suggestion of a new canal in East Africa has quietly triggered discussions inside the strategic circles of several major powers. At the center of these discussions lies a simple reality. Whichever nation or bloc controls Africa's trade corridors controls one of the most resource-rich regions on Earth. From copper in the DRC to cobalt in Katanga, from Uganda's oil to Rwanda's coltan, from Tanzania's gas to Angola's offshore reserves, these materials fuel global manufacturing and renewable energy transitions. A new shipping canal would reshape access to all of them. That is why global intelligence analysts, foreign ministries, and economic advisors are not laughing at this idea. They are studying it. Because such a canal would fundamentally reorder the strategic map of Africa. For China, the implications are profound. Beijing has spent the past 2 decades building ports, railways, special economic zones, and energy infrastructure across Africa under the Belt and Road Initiative. China's vision is clear: secure long-term access to minerals and markets that can support its industrial dominance. A ship canal that bypasses the ports China has invested billions into would create a parallel corridor outside its direct influence. Beijing is not threatened by the canal, but it would want to shape it. It would want to help build it, finance it, secure it, and ultimately integrate it into its global infrastructure web. For the United States, the calculation is different. Washington has been trying to counter China's influence in Africa through strategic investments, security partnerships, and resource agreements. A canal that increases African autonomy could either empower US allies or give China another foothold, depending on who leads the project. American think tanks already warn that Africa must not fall into exclusive dependency on any foreign power. But they also recognize that a major African-led infrastructure initiative could shift global trade routes away from zones of conflict and toward more stable lanes, something the US would quietly support. Europe faces yet another set of consequences. The EU imports vast quantities of African minerals, agricultural products, and raw materials. But European industries depend heavily on the Suez Canal, a route now repeatedly threatened by regional instability. A new East African canal would provide alternative pathways for European shipping, safer, more reliable, and less vulnerable to Middle Eastern conflict. But there's a catch. It would also reduce Europe's leverage over African trade, shifting economic power toward African nations themselves. As for the Middle East, especially Egypt, the stakes are existential. The Suez Canal generates more than $9 billion annually for Egypt. It is the country's primary strategic asset and one of the world's most important maritime choke points. A new canal in East Africa would not replace Suez, but it could divert a meaningful portion of traffic, particularly for vessels serving East African and Indian Ocean routes. The competition would be subtle but real. Egypt is watching, not opposing, not interfering, but monitoring closely. Because global shipping is a zero-sum game and every new route shifts economic gravity. In Africa itself, governments are divided. Kenya and Tanzania, whose ports serve as gateways for East Africa, fear losing economic influence. Their ports fund development, employ thousands, and anchor their national economies. A canal bypassing their coastlines could weaken their maritime dominance. Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and Eastern DRC, on the other hand, welcome the idea. The canal would give them sovereignty over their trade, freedom from political disputes, and access to the Indian Ocean without dependency. The DRC remains at the center of this complex equation. The country's enormous mineral wealth, rapidly growing megaprojects, and emerging infrastructure corridors position it as Africa's next continental engine. But the lack of stable logistical routes shackles its potential. That is why President Felix Tshisekedi's government has been aggressively pursuing new pathways: the Banana Deep-Water Port, the Lobito Corridor, the modernization of border crossings, and enhanced security for mining regions. These initiatives are pragmatic, realistic, and already under construction. But insiders know that even these measures cannot fully unlock the DRC's economic might. And this brings us to the quiet truth behind the canal proposal. It solves a geopolitical vulnerability that many African leaders privately acknowledge, but rarely say out loud. Africa cannot dominate global trade if it cannot control its own routes. But the proposal's obstacles are not limited to politics. There are human obstacles too. Communities along the potential route would face relocation, disruption of livelihoods, interference with farming and grazing land, and environmental risks. Africa's history with megaprojects is complicated. Promises are easily made, but often broken. For a canal of this magnitude to be acceptable, it would need protections stronger than any African project before it. Land rights guarantees, community compensation, environmental safeguards, water system management, and transparent governance. But if Africa can solve these problems, if it can build infrastructure with fairness and long-term vision, then something extraordinary becomes possible. Africa would reshape global trade on its own terms. Part 4 closes with a rising tension. The world is no longer asking if Africa will transform. It is asking how Africa will choose to do so and who will stand with it when it does. As discussions surrounding the East African Ship Canal intensify, a moment arrives that every major transformation in history eventually faces. The moment when the idea stops being theoretical and becomes a choice. For months, African leaders, economists, engineers, and regional bodies have debated the canal quietly behind closed doors. But when the initial feasibility studies, cost projections, and geopolitical analyses begin circulating among top policymakers, a simple truth emerges: Africa is standing at the edge of a decision that could redefine the continent for a century. The turning point begins with the DRC. As Africa's mineral powerhouse, the DRC understands the canal's transformative power more than anyone. Its copper, cobalt, lithium, tin, and rare earths represent the backbone of the world's clean energy economy. Global electric vehicles, battery factories, tech giants all rely on the minerals buried beneath Congo's soil. Yet every delay at Mombasa, every political protest at Dar es Salaam, every port strike along the coast throws the entire supply chain into chaos. Billions lost, contracts stalled, manufacturing slowed, investors panicking. The quiet fear within African industry is this: Africa has the resources to lead the 21st century, but not the logistics to control its own future. And that fear becomes the engine driving the canal discussion forward. Behind the scenes, a coalition of nations begins to take shape. Rwanda signals its willingness to provide security guarantees. Uganda announces its interest in financing portions of the route through public-private partnerships. Burundi and South Sudan, desperate for reliable trade access, openly encourage the idea. Even Tanzania, despite its concerns, expresses readiness to join discussions, not wanting to be left behind if history turns. But it is the DRC's involvement that shocks international observers. President Tshisekedi's advisors quietly release internal documents that show the long-term national gains from a canal could exceed $150 billion over the first 25 years. These numbers circulate among mining companies, logistics firms, and global investors. Suddenly, what was once dismissed as fantasy becomes a topic of tense boardroom meetings in New York, Beijing, Dubai, and Brussels. The world begins to pay attention. And then, something bigger happens, something no one predicted. A rare alignment of natural phenomena shifts the narrative. Scientists monitoring the Congo Basin and the East African Rift begin detecting subtle changes in groundwater movement, seismic pressure points, and altitude variations. These geological updates do not make the canal easier, but they make it far more urgent. For years, the East African Rift, the massive tectonic system slowly splitting the continent, has been expanding. New cracks appear in Ethiopia, underground fault lines shift in Kenya, and tremors ripple across Uganda. These movements threaten existing roads, bridges, and pipelines. Suddenly, the infrastructure Africa depends on is no longer guaranteed. This realization strikes the continent like a quiet thunder. If Africa does not build new routes now, nature may soon decide for them. The canal discussion intensifies. International reaction becomes frantic. Western diplomats rush to consult African presidents, desperate to understand whether the project will break existing alliances. Chinese representatives accelerate their engagement, offering engineering teams and financing models. Turkish firms propose initial survey missions. Gulf states express interest in funding strategic ports along the route. Africa, for the first time in generations, finds itself courted, not controlled. But with influence comes pressure. Global powers understand that whoever helps Africa build this canal will have unparalleled access to its trade networks, its mineral wealth, and its political goodwill. Africa begins receiving warnings disguised as friendly advice. Such a project could destabilize the region. Costs may be too high, better remain with existing ports. It may provoke competitive tensions with Egypt and the Red Sea states. It will be vulnerable to sabotage in unstable regions. And then there's the most common one. You do not have the technology, you cannot build this. Across African social media, the anger is immediate. How can a continent that builds mines, dams, railways, cities, and massive power stations be told it cannot build a waterway? Why must Africa always depend on others? Why must its dreams be impossible until someone else profits from them? Outrage swells. Pan-African influencers, engineers, historians, and economists push back. They remind the world that the pyramids were built by Africans. Timbuktu's scholars once preserved the world's scientific knowledge. Great Zimbabwe rose from stone. Ethiopia carved churches from mountains. Mali once mapped stars before Europe charted its seas. If the Suez Canal could be built in 1869, if the Panama Canal could be built before modern machinery, then what exactly is Africa incapable of? The psychological shift is enormous. Suddenly, the canal is no longer just an infrastructure proposal, it becomes a symbol of sovereignty, a symbol of unity, a symbol of Africa's refusal to let the future be dictated from outside. But the climax of this moment comes when a confidential report is leaked, an early draft of the canal's potential route, drawn across the heart of the continent. For the first time, the public sees a vision of what the canal might look like. A bold, serpentine waterway cutting through river systems, wetlands, valleys, and plateaus. A corridor connecting nations that have been divided for centuries. A continental spine of trade, connecting raw materials to global markets without the bottlenecks of old colonial ports. This leaked map ignites Africa. Newsrooms debate it. Universities analyze it. Entrepreneurs dream of new logistics hubs. Farmers imagine exporting directly to Asia and Europe. Students visualize working on the engineering teams that make history. Miners imagine a future where their work reaches the world without delay. For days, the continent is electrified. And then the inevitable backlash. Skeptics warn of ecological damage. Economists argue that Africa should first fix existing ports. Activists fear displacement of villages. Water experts warn of river disruption. Security analysts predict tensions along the route. Conservationists warn of wildlife corridors being destroyed. But each criticism reveals the same truth. People are finally taking the project seriously. They criticize it not because it is impossible, but because it is suddenly real. And so Africa reaches the threshold of history, a moment where fear and ambition meet head-on, a moment where the continent must decide whether to stay within the boundaries drawn for it or redraw the map entirely. That is where Part 5 ends, with Africa standing before a door no generation before it has ever dared to open.